might have been green. The problem is, as I've found, as we've gone on, the bigger the group, the slower it goes. They've got this shallow.
Yes.
And some of them are getting a bit cheeky as well. Like on Saturday, like I was sliding off to look on my own.
everybody. I'm delighted to welcome this evening Dr. Lucy West, who is curator at Dulwich Picture Gallery. Her PhD from Leeds University was in collaboration with both the National Gallery and the Bowes Museum, and centred on the art market for old master paintings in the 19th century. Before working at Dulwich, she's held positions at both the Royal Collection and Compton Verney, amongst others. So a massive thank you to Lucy for travelling up here today to share your insights with us. But I also wanted to thank Dulwich Picture Gallery as a whole institution, particularly for their support of the Spanish Gallery from the very outset, with a series of really highlight loans. So very thankful to the Gallery for supporting us. Welcome everyone this evening to the Auckland project, both in person and online. But without further ado, I'm introducing Lucy.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Claire, for that really kind introduction, and a really heartfelt thanks to the team here at the Auckland Project for making me feel so welcome and for inviting me to speak this evening. As you can see, I am talking all about artists and Dulwich Picture Gallery's Spanish paintings. And really in this lecture this evening, I wanted to take the opportunity, as Claire mentioned, to really celebrate our loan to the Spanish Gallery of the portrait Prince Baltasar Carlos on horseback, painted by a member of the workshop of Diego Velázquez in Madrid around the year 1635. And there's a little sneak peek of the painting on this opening slide here. So the occasion of this loan to the Spanish Gallery prompted me to delve through our archives at Dulwich Picture Gallery and look into the wider loan history of our portrait of Prince Baltasar Carlos, which you can see on the right there. I was fascinated to discover that the very first time that this painting was lent by Dulwich Picture Gallery was to the Royal Academy's Art School in London in the 1820s, to be studied and copied by the painting students there. Founded in 1769, the Academy was then based at New Somerset House on the Strand in central London, and the painting school, as part of its art teaching provision, was then in its infancy. So on the left of this slide, I'm showing our painting Rembrandt's Girl at a Window, which was lent to the Royal Academy schools in 1878 to 9, and it just gives a wonderful impression of what that experience of loaning our collection to the Royal Academy was like. Loaning an artwork always offers the important opportunity for the object in question to be understood in new ways, placed within new contexts and seen by fresh eyes. And this is certainly the case for Prince Baltasar Carlos's portrait at the Spanish Gallery today. But a similar desire to share art would have also been a key driver for the loan of this painting to the Royal Academy 200 years ago. So as I dug through our records, more information came to light, and I found that Prince Baltasar Carlos's equestrian portrait was just one of various Spanish paintings by Velázquez, by Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, and others, which were lent by Dulwich Picture Gallery to the Royal Academy's painting school during the 19th and early 20th centuries, as part of an official loan system that lasted from 1816, so just when Dulwich Picture Gallery was being founded, right up to the Second World War. So the art school had been a key part of the Royal Academy since its foundation in 1769, and by the time of the loan of Prince Baltasar Carlos's portrait in the 1820s, around 1,500 students had entered the schools, an intake of roughly 25 students a year across painting, sculpture, architecture and engraving. And it was this annual loan of usually around 6 pictures from the Dulwich Picture Gallery collection that in fact established the painting school at the Academy, distinct from the older elements of the teaching provision there, such as the Plaster Academy and the Life Drawing School. So on the left of this slide, we see the drawing school, so we have students, notably male students, gathered together in the amphitheatre style seating and drawing from this life model who has adopted a classical pose. And then on the right, we have a watercolour of the antique school, so an opportunity for students to copy from casts of antique sculpture. And we can see all of those casts lining the walls and floor of that space. So at the painting school, Dulwich Picture Gallery's Spanish paintings were placed into a formalised culture of learning and reproduction, a system which used the copying of old master paintings in the flesh as a fundamental teaching tool for its students. So the lecture today will explore how artists at the Royal Academy and beyond encountered the Spanish paintings at Dulwich Picture Gallery, how they responded to them, and how they translated their visions of Spain for the wider British art world, in a period when Spain was quietly beginning to become a source of particular fascination. So although today's lecture just focuses on the Dulwich collection really, it is part of a much wider landscape of British artists looking at, copying and learning from Spanish painting. And there is, of course, a very interesting copy of a Spanish painting here at the Auckland project, the depiction of Benjamin by the 18th century artist and dealer Arthur Pond, who is a fascinating character of the 18th century art world. But this is his copy of Benjamin after Francisco de Zurbarán's 17th century series, Jacob and his 12 Sons, in the castle's long dining room. And I'm showing Pond's painting here on the screen. So in 1756, and I'm sure many of you know this in far more detail than I do, Bishop Trevor was only able to purchase 12 of the 13 paintings in the series, missing out on the depiction of Benjamin. And interestingly, at £21, Pond's contemporary copy was just as expensive as the priciest works in Zurbarán's own series, making copies a very good business to be in. For now, though, we will travel from County Durham down to South London to ask the question, what and where is Dulwich Picture Gallery, first of all, and why were artists attracted to its Spanish paintings in the 19th century? So I'm going to do a bit of a potted history of Dulwich Picture Gallery. Our story really began in 1790, when the art dealer Noel d'Essenfond and his protégé, really, the artist Francis Bourgeois, were commissioned to put together a royal art collection for the King of Poland, Stanislaus Augustus. And this kind of came about because his brother had been to London on a diplomatic mission and heard of their reputation. So d'Essenfond and Bourgeois, who I'm showing here, so we have Bourgeois on the left and d'Essenfond on the right, spent 5 years between 1790 and 1795 buying masterpieces from across Western Europe, and they amassed works from the Dutch, Flemish, French, Italian, Spanish, of course, and British schools, dating broadly between 1500 and 1800, with an emphasis on the Baroque period. Star acquisitions, which we have already glimpsed in a previous slide, included Rembrandt's Girl at a Window, allegedly once placed in the window of this Dutch master's Amsterdam house to trick passers-by into thinking there was a real girl leaning out of the window. So in 1795, so 5 years after our founders had kicked off their mission to acquire a royal collection for the King of Poland, the king was overthrown, leaving the founders with a royal collection on their hands for which they had not yet received payment and which had no permanent home. But with the financial support of d'Essenfond's wife, Margaret, who heralded from a wealthy Welsh industrial family, the trio eventually landed on this idea of developing the collection further, fine-tuning it a little bit, and building Britain's first purpose-built public picture gallery in which to house it. And I'm showing here a portrait of Margaret after the original version, which is currently on long-term loan to us, by Joshua Reynolds, which was painted in around 1757 when Margaret was just 20 years old. In 1811, at the death of Francis Bourgeois, friend, architect and royal academician as well, John Soane, was tasked with creating a dedicated building for their picture collection in Dulwich Village in South London. And Dulwich was then in the countryside, far away from the worrying London smog, which really was a concern to the founders for the preservation of their paintings. Soane's inspiring design for the gallery included lantern lights in the ceiling, which meant the paintings could be viewed in natural light, and also an atmospheric mausoleum where our three founders remain buried to this day. And I don't know if any of you have been to Dulwich Picture Gallery, but it's a very quirky kind of addition to the space. So I'm showing here on the left the exterior of the gallery in this characteristic, quite simple brick design with these classicising rounded arches. And then a little shot of the mausoleum, which has this really evocative yellow light, which is created through the amber glass that Soane installed in that space. So you have a kind of contrast between the natural light of the collection spaces and this yellow spiritual light of the mausoleum. The founders bequeathed 19 Spanish paintings to Dulwich Picture Gallery in 1811, which had been acquired through the British auction market. So we have a combination of things going on. We have some paintings which were already on English shores as part of historic collections since the 17th century, while others were newly arrived from the continent, namely through the French art market or through other diplomatic routes. In a list of the founders' pictures drawn up in 1804 for insurance purposes, which I'm showing on the right, the Spanish paintings were among the ones that were valued the highest. At 1,200 guineas, Murillo's painting of the Madonna of the Rosary, on the left here, was the most valuable painting in the entire collection, along with a large nativity scene by the French artist Nicolas Poussin, insured for exactly the same amount. So we've got the insurance, a page from the insurance list on the right from our archives, and then I've just marked the entry for the Madonna of the Rosary, valued at 1,200 guineas on the right there with the arrow. Perhaps to be expected is that 13 of these foundational Spanish works were attributed to the painter Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, baptised in the southern Spanish city of Seville on the 1st of January 1618. And he's thought to have left Seville only once to visit the royal collections in Madrid. Today, 4 of the paintings that were acquired as by Murillo by our founders, the Virgin of the Rosary on the left, the Flower Girl, the second painting in there, and then Invitation to a Game of Argolla, and the 3 Boys, remain among the artists, some of the artist's most important works. All 4 paintings, when you see them like this together, are really evocative of the unique appeal that Murillo's work had among British audiences during the 18th century and onwards. So you have this kind of atmospheric sweetness of the Virgin and Child, and the characterful, though very fictional, realism of the genre scenes. So these children on the right-hand side, apparently kind of plucked from the streets of Seville. The other 9 paintings acquired as by Murillo have since been reattributed as being by artists in Murillo's workshop, as by other Spanish painters or by later imitators, and we'll look at some of those in a little while. The other painter who provided the complementary cornerstone of British understandings of Spanish paintings in the period was Diego Velázquez. The 19th century Scottish artist David Wilkie, who will crop up again, famously found a softness and femininity in Murillo, and contrastingly a sparkle and intellect in Velázquez. So Velázquez was 20 years Murillo's senior, again born in Seville, and later came up under the royal patronage of King Philip IV, moving to Madrid to become the king's favourite court painter and a senior member of the royal household. 4 paintings were bequeathed by the founders to Dulwich Picture Gallery as by Velázquez, including our portrait, which we will be talking about this evening, on the left here of the fated heir, Prince Baltasar Carlos, and then his father on the right, King Philip IV of Spain. So in 1634 to 5, around 10 years after Velázquez first arrived at court in Madrid, he was commissioned by King Philip IV, who we saw on the previous slide, to create 5 equestrian portraits for the Salon de Reinos, or the Hall of Realms, in the city's palace called the Buen Retiro. While Velázquez enlisted the help of assistants, he alone was responsible for painting Prince Baltasar on horseback and King Philip IV's equestrian portraits. And I'm showing here the original version of the portrait of Prince Baltasar Carlos, which is in the Prado, and then our version on the right-hand side, which is on loan to the Spanish Gallery. So our portrait is a scaled-down copy by a member of Velázquez's workshop of the portrait made for the Salon de Reinos. Baltasar Carlos was around 6 years old when it was painted, and he really appears quite unfazed by his rearing horse, and of course good horsemanship was a really well-accepted shorthand for the masterful control of a kingdom. And you might notice that the body of this horse seems really enormous and quite barrel-like. And this was actually because the painting hung very high up in the space that it was intended for. And so this kind of visual trick righted itself when you viewed the painting from below. We can see that landscape dominates the background of this painting. And we have mountains topped with snow, possibly of late spring, particularly on the right-hand side there. And these would have been recognisable as those of the Guadarrama Mountains, which would have been visible from the Buen Retiro Palace in which this painting was displayed. And again, the mountains, of course, become another reminder of the far reaches of Baltasar Carlos's future empire. Yet, he was never to inherit the Spanish kingdom, dying from smallpox at the age of 16 and heralding the eve of continued power struggles over the Spanish throne. So from Spain and back to South London, in the 19th century, when this painting was part of our collection at Dulwich Picture Gallery, it was really celebrated by writers and artists and thinkers of the period. The art writer William Hazlitt, in his tour of picture galleries in England, could write that this portrait was, and I'm quoting, one of the most delightful things in the delightful collection at Dulwich Picture Gallery. And he certainly wasn't alone in this opinion. But just to finish our kind of roundup of paintings that of Spanish paintings that were bequeathed to the collection, one outlier, I think, among our founders' Spanish works was this painting of Christ carrying the cross, which was attributed far more unusually to Luis de Morales when it first entered the collection. And there are some works by Luis de Morales in the Spanish gallery, so it's interesting to compare to this original attribution. Born around 1510, Morales was based for a significant portion of his life in and around Badajoz, which is today situated close to the Portuguese border. And his name begins to trickle into auction records in the 18th century and was known in England through a collection of artist biographies by the Spanish biographer Antonio Palomino, which was translated into English in 1739. But even so, artists like Morales were notably brushed over by commentators from the next century, the 19th century, such as the Scottish artist David Wilkie. And the enigma around this painting really continues. Today it's lost the attribution to Morales, and it's now thought to be generically by an artist from the Seville school. So research continues into this painting to find its author. Particularly unusual is that this painting is one of only 2 Spanish paintings in the Dulwich Picture Gallery collection which depict violent or intensely religious scenes. The other one being our depiction of the crucifixion of St. Peter on the right, which entered the collection as by Velázquez, but today is known to be by the Madrid-born painter José Antolínez, and I'm showing both of those paintings on the slide. I think it does stand to reason that these overtly religious paintings were less popular among our founders and visitors to Dulwich Picture Gallery when we consider that Catholic art still held a very complicated place in cultural consciousness in Britain in the first half of the 19th century, with the Catholic Emancipation Act only being passed in 1829. This act removed, or at least reduced, the restrictions that had been placed on Catholics and allowed Catholics in Britain and Ireland to sit as MPs and hold public office. The art dealer William Buchanan, who was a contemporary of our founders and was working within the same art market, art dealing networks, could write in 1803 on the subject of British taste, and I'm quoting from one of his letters, which are recorded in a fantastic volume by the scholar Hugh Brigstock. So here we go. It is the flowing and mellow-toned pictures that please all, pictures of bravura and breadth of light, not dark brown pictures of saints. People don't like to see death in their drawing rooms or dining rooms, and don't give all their money to be made melancholy, end quote. So from Buchanan's comments, we can see why bourgeois and Desenfants and early visitors to Dulwich Picture Gallery might have preferred the golden atmosphere of Murillo's Virgin and Child to St. Peter's gruesome crucifixion. So the historic Spanish paintings at Dulwich Picture Gallery have long been appreciated by artists, writers and thinkers. And to give a sense of their popularity, between 1879 and 1899, artists registered at Dulwich Picture Gallery to make copies of Murillo's Flower Girl on 108 different occasions, officially making this painting the most copied in the Dulwich Picture Gallery collection. And I'm just showing here, quite lightheartedly, a little search that I conducted on the Art UK website, which has, paintings, images of artworks in collections across Britain. And when you type in the Flower Girl Dulwich Picture Gallery, the first 3 entries that come up, among plenty of others, are copies of the Flower Girl. So I just did a little screenshot there to highlight that point. So another great quote. The 19th century art critic John Ruskin, a local to Dulwich Picture Gallery, he lived in Denmark Hill, so just up the road, made the withering remark that, and I'm quoting, "I have never entered the Dulwich Gallery for 14 years without seeing at least 3 copyists before the Murillo. I've never seen one before the Paolo Veronese." So he clearly felt the Italians were being hard done by in our collection. By the 1830s, there was great panic among the keeper and trustees of Dulwich Picture Gallery because copies were really getting a little bit out of hand. An artist and Royal Academician called John Jackson had made a 1-for-1 copy in oils of Murillo's Flower Girl, no surprise there, which he had actually sold at quite a considerable price. So in 1831, this led to the trustees sending quite a disgruntled letter to the Royal Academy stating that, number 1, loans of pictures to the Royal Academy are solely for the use of students in their studies and not for private gain. Number 2, copies are not to be made for the purpose of engraving them without permission, because of course making and selling prints and engravings at this time could be quite big business. And number 3, no entire copy in oil of the same size as the original picture should be made. Clearly, copies of the Spanish paintings at Dulwich Picture Gallery were taking on lives of their own. So, we'll fast forward 2 centuries, and right now we are working with the contemporary British painter at Dulwich Picture Gallery called Samaya Critchlow. And her work is exhibited at Dulwich as part of a display entitled The Chamber, which is the outcome of Critchlow's extended time that she spent with the collection, really since childhood, but for this exhibition in the last year. Critchlow is endlessly fascinated by the old masters, and among her wider output of work, another Spanish artist, the 18th century Francisco Goya, provides an undercurrent of romantic inspiration for her. So we have this Hitchcock-like swarm of owls and bats in the etching The Sleep of Reason, here on the left from the British Museum collection. And then on the right, Critchlow reimagines this etching in her own study on paper entitled Owls, Bats and Cats. So as is probably becoming clear, when the foundation stone of Dulwich Picture Gallery was laid in 1811, contemporary artists, Critchlow's past counterparts, were central to the gallery's mission. When the gallery opened to the public in 1817 as Britain's first purpose-built public gallery, artists were invited to come and copy from the collection to aid their learning and to enrich their exposure to historic paintings. And if we study the wonderful early watercolour views of the gallery, such as this one that I'm showing on the slide by James Stefanoff, we find visual evidence of artists copying from our collection. This watercolour shows the interior of Dulwich Picture Gallery from around 1830. But of particular interest for me is this woman that I've highlighted in yellow, and then I've done a little close-up on the right-hand side. She sits almost out of sight through the archway. She is in the process of making a copy from one of the paintings that we as viewers can't actually see. She has a fairly ad hoc setup, so there's no easel, and her book and materials are balanced on the stool and on the chair next to her. And her drawing board is resting on her knee. Could this be perhaps Hilda Bennett, Helen Mary Johnson, Marion Burnham Brooke, or Edith Durham? All women artists who registered to make copies at the gallery during the 19th century, but whose identities and works continue to be quite difficult to find. But let's imagine for a moment that the female artist in this watercolour is copying one of our Spanish paintings. Certainly in this watercolour, two of our most important Spanish works are hung in prominent locations. So among this crowded salon hang, this kind of floor-to-ceiling hang, we have the Flower Girl just here to the right-hand side of the arch, and then we have the Madonna of the Rosary just here, again to the right-hand side of the nearest arch. So although we can only muse on what this lady is copying, I couldn't resist including this painting by Louise Perrault of an artist copying this wonderful Murillo in the collection of the Louvre in Paris at the turn of the 20th century. So, in addition to artists visiting Dulwich Picture Gallery, as mentioned, from 1816 until the Second World War, a group of paintings were lent to the Royal Academy annually, an initiative which, as I mentioned, helped to establish the painting school at the Royal Academy. The Academy's first president, Sir Joshua Reynolds, encouraged students to not simply engage in what he saw as mindless mechanical copying, but to contemplate also the kind of lofty and learned conceptions of the artist at hand while doing so, therefore infusing the copy with a kind of vitality. So the image that I showed before here on the left is a painting by Francis Grace, executed on the occasion that Rembrandt's Girl at a Window was lent to the painting school from Dulwich Picture Gallery in the 1870s. And we've got the Girl at a Window close up on the right-hand side. And we can see this really wonderful scene where the painting is propped, the original painting is propped there on an easel in the middle, and we have two artists hard at work copying the painting. In 1830, the British landscape painter John Constable was on the Royal Academy Committee, which selected Landscape with Windmills by the 17th century Dutch artist Jacob van Ruysdael to be lent to the painting school. This was also the year that Constable himself was elected a member of the Royal Academy, surprisingly at the age of 52. While Landscape with Windmills was on loan to the painting school, Constable painted a one-for-one copy. So on this slide, we see Constable's copy here on the left, and then the Ruysdael original on the right-hand side. And making this copy of Ruysdael's work would have really allowed Constable to engage with the conventions of 17th century Dutch painting, a genre which so influenced his work. And what's also interesting about this pairing, a slight tangent, but I think it's interesting, is while this is more or less a kind of one-for-one copy in terms of size and composition, a key difference between the paintings, and it is difficult to see in this image, is this little group of figures here. So we have a man in a red jacket on a horse, and then a little dog and a little figure following. And this is absent from the Ruysdael painting. These figures were, in fact, recorded in Ruysdael's original painting in 1835, and they were already in Ruysdael's painting when Constable was making his copy in 1830. But when Ruysdael's painting, this one on the right, came to be conserved in 1997, the boy, the horse and the rider were discovered to be later 19th century, 18th century, 19th century editions and were removed. So therefore Constable's painting becomes a really wonderful document of the material history of the painting that he was copying. Since 2006, Constable's painting has been in our collection at Dulwich Picture Gallery thanks to an anonymous gift, a constant reminder of the importance of contemporary artists to the collection and vice versa. So how did artists interact with the Spanish paintings in the Dulwich Picture Gallery collection? Before the collection had even been amassed by our founders, Dulwich Picture Gallery's then future Spanish paintings already had a history of being copied by artists from London's Royal Academy. In the late 18th century, the Royal Academician Samuel Woodford had executed these studies on the right-hand side of Murillo's painting The Invitation to a Game of Argolla, where he really delighted in recording the expressive nature of the children's faces. So in the original painting, here on the left, an errand boy is halfway through devouring a hunk of bread, and you can see that he's still got a little piece just dangling from his mouth on the left-hand side. We have this lovely charming detail of the dog who is kind of hungrily waiting for crumbs to fall. And then we have this child who is seated on the ground, and they are petitioning this boy to play with them a game of Argolla, which was a little bit like croquet, so you're hitting balls through hoops. And this child is holding one of the hoops that the ball will eventually be hit through. And although Murillo gives the impression that these children are plucked from the streets of Seville with their torn clothes and their exposed feet, it instead really shows quite a charming and picaresque view of mischievous children, certainly not the harshness of a life in poverty. And after all, we remember the words that I quoted from the dealer William Buchanan, buyers of art don't give all of their money to be made melancholy. So whether Woodford saw the invitation to a game of Argolla in the collection of the Dulwich Picture Gallery, the collection of the founders of Dulwich Picture Gallery is difficult to say, because the painting had also been part of historic collections in England since the 17th century. So before it was acquired by Noel d'Essenfant for Dulwich in around 1803, 1804, it hung at Godolphin House in the collection of the Earls of Godolphin, just near St James's Palace in central London. Another artist who likely saw the invitation to a game of Argolla by Murillo at Godolphin House was the English painter Thomas Gainsborough, who lived just a 5-minute walk away from Godolphin House. The founders of Dulwich Picture Gallery, d'Essenfant and Bourgeois, were certainly great admirers of Gainsborough and acquired his wonderful portrait here on the left of Philippe Jacques de Lutterberg for their collection. And they would have been gratified to know that after their lifetimes, a series of bequests in 1831, 1835 and 1911 brought 6 more Gainsboroughs into the Dulwich Picture Gallery collection. And I'm just showing on the right here our beloved portrait of the Linley sisters, as we affectionately call them, Elizabeth and Mary Linley, who were famed during their lifetime for their musical skill. So Gainsborough was a fan of Murillo, and he even purchased paintings by Murillo from none other than our founder, Noel d'Essenfant, for his own art collection. Gainsborough had likely seen the invitation to a game of Argolla at Godolphin House, as I mentioned, and the composition of Gainsborough's now lost painting of a shepherd, which I'm showing here in the form of a mezzotint on the right-hand side from the British Museum's collection, borrows quite directly from the seated pose of the child playing Argolla in the Dulwich Picture Gallery painting. But instead of the upturned face and toothy grin of the child in the Dulwich Picture Gallery painting, the shepherd in Gainsborough's composition looks up to this divine light. So he gives the image a kind of spiritual gloss, the divine kind of rays of light emanating from the top left of the image. And this really would have been what we call one of Gainsborough's fancy pictures, in inverted commas, which he turned towards at the end of his career, which kind of imagined these pastoral figures in fictional settings, usually landscapes, infused with this kind of spirit of Murillo. So these works by Woodford and by Gainsborough testify to the popularity that Murillo's country scenes of children were garnering in England by the turn of the 18th century. So artists and indeed the Royal Academy had always been at the centre of the founder's mission for Dulwich Picture Gallery. Francis Bourgeois, one of our founders, was himself an artist and also made a Royal Academician, so they're really part of these networks. Before the gallery's foundation in 1811, Desenfants and Bourgeois were living at 38 and 39 Charlotte Street, which is now confusingly called Hallam Street, in Marylebone in London, and it was here that their collection was first brought together, curated and hung. And this informal watercolour by the artist Paul Sandby, who was a regular artist visitor to Charlotte Street, shows the founders seated at their Charlotte Street home. So we have Bourgeois on the left, who has kind of folded his arms and is leaning back on the settee with his eyes closed, almost as if he's listening in quite a long-suffering way to his partner in crime, Noel Desenfants, on the right, who's wearing a very informal clothing and has his foot up with kind of abandon on the footstool in front of him. The founders even had the idea in 1810 that they could purchase their property at Charlotte Street from their landlord, the Duke of Portland, in order that the Charlotte Street house might become, and I'm quoting from them, gratuitously open to artists as well as to the public. And it's interesting to think about what the Charlotte Street house might have been within this context of the public provision of art in Britain, because it was a period where many private individuals were beginning to open up their collections in the absence, at that point, of a national gallery of painting, which wouldn't be inaugurated until 1824. In fact, in 1799, Desenfants published his own, albeit failed, plan for establishing a national gallery, a plan that he believed would benefit the progress of the arts in England, Scotland and Ireland. And I'm showing on the right the frontispiece of Desenfants' plan on this slide. Although the Duke of Portland rejected the proposition for Charlotte Street to become a long-term didactic site for artists, it's interesting to think about how the Spanish paintings were hung there. They were spread throughout the house. So the three large Murillos, which we've seen already, so the Invitation to a Game of Argolla, the Three Boys, and the Virgin of the Rosary, all of which I'm showing here on the left of the slide, were all displayed in the so-called skylit room, which was right at the top of the house. Also, we would have found there the painting formerly attributed to Luis de Morales, today to the Seville School, of Christ carrying the cross. So we can see the arrangement sketched out in the catalogue compiled in 1813 after the death of the founders. I'm showing that on the right here. So these are all the sort of sketched up images of not the pictures, but the frames of the pictures. So there in the impressive top-lit space, arguably the centrepiece of the house at Charlotte Street, Murillo's most popular paintings could be viewed in what were thought to be the most optimal lighting conditions of the period. Members of the Royal Academy, such as Samuel Woodford, the artist and diarist Joseph Farrington, the watercolourist Paul Sandby, and the Scottish painter David Wilkie, were all invited to Charlotte Street to view the paintings alongside other artists of their time. So in the spirit of the age, Charlotte Street took on the character of a semi-private museum, where by invitation, artists could come to view nearly 400 old master paintings. From the time of Dulwich Picture Gallery's foundation, its link with the Royal Academy and its schools were actually written into the yearly running of the gallery. So 2 years before the gallery opened publicly in 1817, students from the Royal Academy were invited to visit. Francis Bourgeois, one of the founders, had also written into his will in 1811 that Royal Academicians should be asked to make an annual visit of inspection to Dulwich Picture Gallery, and then they would be recompensed with a meal in the gallery's enfilade, which sounds lovely, but it was an idea that quickly ran out of budget. So it was swapped from being done annually to being slightly more sporadically. But I'm showing here a plan of one of the gallery's luncheons from slightly later, 1894, which is in our archives. In 1815, the gallery's first keeper, Ralph Coburn, confirmed with the Royal Academy's secretary that Dulwich Picture Gallery would be prepared to loan up to 6 paintings every year to the Academy schools from which students could study and make copies. In fact, Coburn himself had trained at the schools as well and was part of these networks, and he was an early member of this kind of generation of museum keepers and directors who heralded from an artistic background. A major project that Coburn carried out was his production of a set of coloured aquatints of 50 celebrated works in the collection, which were hand-coloured by his daughter and published in 1818 and then again in 1830. A copy of the publication can be found in the Royal Academy's library today. These aquatints, and I'm just showing a couple of examples here, show Coburn's perceptions of popular taste. 2 Spanish paintings were included. So we have Murillo's Flower Girl on the left, and Jacob and Rachel at the Well on the right, which was then attributed to Murillo, but today is thought to be by a member of his circle. As I mentioned earlier, the Flower Girl was one of the most copied paintings in the Dulwich Picture Gallery collection. Jacob and Rachel at the Well, although it's far less known, I would say, in the context of our collection today, was also much praised by early 19th century commentators, notably for its depth of feeling. So, taken from the book of Genesis, it captures the moment when Jacob sees Rachel standing by a well. We can see the well there on the left of the couple, with her father's flocks of sheep who pepper the composition here in the background. And he immediately falls in love with her. And here the figures are shown in this moment of tender embrace. The gallery's next keeper after Coburn from 1821 was Stephen Poyntz Denning, who was also an artist and who actually went on to work for Queen Victoria. He made copies from Dulwich's Spanish paintings, The Flower Girl, of course, we're seeing a theme, and The Madonna of the Rosary, which I'm showing here. While Ralph Coburn's aquatints were for public consumption, Denning's copies represent personal studies by an artist taking painterly lessons from copying the Spanish masters. Ralph Coburn's proposal in 1816 to lend annual groups of paintings from Dulwich Picture Gallery to the Royal Academy schools signalled the first time that painting had been officially brought into the curriculum at the Academy. And as I've highlighted here on this slide, by the time Denning commenced his tenure as keeper of Dulwich Picture Gallery in 1821, managing the loan system to the Royal Academy was discreetly written into the keeper's set of responsibilities, and I've just written that out on the right there of the slide. The first group of paintings was lent in 1816, and after that, Spanish paintings featured frequently among the works requested by the Royal Academy schools. So we can take a sample of the years between 1829, when Prince Baltasar Carlos was lent, until the middle of the 19th century to map exactly what was being loaned from Dulwich Picture Gallery to the Royal Academy schools in the earliest years of this scheme. And it should be noted here that I'm employing the 19th century attributions for the paintings that the Royal Academy requested. So the Velázquez, Prince Baltasar Carlos on Horseback, was lent in 1829. Velázquez's Philip IV in 1838, 53 and 57. Murillo's Madonna of the Rosary in 1834 and 48. The Flower Girl here in the centre in 1835, 51 and 57. Murillo's Three Boys just here in 1830 and 1845. The Invitation to a Game of Argolla in 1852. And then we have the Portrait of a Boy, who we will talk about shortly, then attributed to Velázquez, was lent in 1830 as well. So taking this sample, it's striking again that the darker and more intensely religious paintings in the collection were never lent for students to copy from. For example, Christ bearing the cross or the crucifixion of St. Peter. The choices of the Academy regarding which works to borrow both conformed to and served as a catalyst for contemporary taste. And I've already highlighted how Catholic art still held a rather complicated position in British cultural consciousness at the time. The choices of the paintings to be borrowed by the Royal Academy also reflected the particular preferences of the committee who were selecting them. For example, in 1830, among works attributed to Hobbema, Ruysdael, Poussin and Veronese were two Spanish works. One was Portrait of a Boy, which was then attributed to Velázquez, today known to be by Velázquez's son-in-law, Juan Bautista Martínez del Mazo. And the other was Murillo's Three Boys, showing a young water seller waiting for payment from two mischievous seated children. I'm showing the Portrait of a Boy, Luis del Mazo on the left, and the Three Boys here on the right. Among the committee which selected the works to borrow from Dulwich in 1830, including these two, was John Constable, who chose the Ruysdael, which he copied, as we saw in previous slides, and importantly, the Scottish painter David Wilkie. 2 years prior to 1830, so in 1828, Wilkie had just returned from Europe, where he had spent a considerable amount of time in Spain, namely in Madrid and in Seville. And this trip remains often credited as having occasioned a marked change of style and subject matter in Wilkie's work. His reflections on artists such as Velázquez and Murillo and how they might benefit British painting were woven throughout his Spanish letters and journals, posthumously published in 1843. I couldn't help but show here on the left Wilkie's painting of the Guerrilla's Departure, one of 4 works that were acquired by King George IV in 1829. And as Claudia Hopkins has recently highlighted in her writing on Murillo's reception through British artists, Wilkie is quoting here from the seated figures in the Dulwich Murillos, something also noted by the contemporary press when it was displayed for the first time at the Royal Academy. So we have the seated boy here, which is quoting from the seated child in An Invitation to a Game of Argolla. The Royal Academy's choice to borrow one painting from Murillo and one by Velázquez in 1830 surely bears Wilkie's influence. Writing from Spain to Thomas Lawrence, then the president of the Royal Academy, in 1827-8, Wilkie penned, as I mentioned before, that he found a softness and femininity in Murillo and this sparkle and intellect in the work of Velázquez. And I think there certainly is a sparkle and freshness in this intimate study of a young boy by Juan Bautista Martínez del Mazo, which Wilkie and the Royal Academy Committee in 1830 believed to be by Velázquez. But as I mentioned, in fact, Del Mazo married Velázquez's daughter, Francisca, so was Velázquez's son-in-law. And I'm afraid that this image really doesn't do justice to this painting. So I'll have to entice you to Dulwich Picture Gallery to see it in person. But really the sparkle of this work comes from the vivacity of its paint. There's this frothy white collar here, which is made up of lots of thickly but quickly applied brushstrokes. We have the hint of a little ear and this kind of fluidly applied facial features, which almost have the quality of ink. I really think that this painting has a freshness and sparkle which makes me think of much later painters, more modern painters, like Manet or John Singer Sargent. It's a really striking portrait. In fact, this painting would have been a really valuable work for artists at the Royal Academy because it's a study. It's a painting made to assist Dalmazzo with the planning of a future group portrait of his family, which is today in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. And this little boy is Louis, so one of Dalmazzo's sons. And in the finished work, he stands just here in the middle of 8 of Dalmazzo's children. He had 10 children in total, but in the middle of this wonderful family portrait. Studies like this one were and remain important tools for artists to unpick how paintings are constructed. And Dulwich Picture Gallery, in fact, has many important oil sketches and studies within its holdings, particularly by the Flemish artist Peter Paul Rubens. And I'm showing just a couple of examples on the right hand of this slide. So we have Venus mourning Adonis and St. Barbara fleeing her father here. The importance of sketches and studies within our collection evidences that it was very much intended to be a teaching collection for artists when it was being amassed and then fine-tuned by our founders. So perhaps it was while the Royal Academy schools had borrowed the Madonna of the Rosary from Dulwich in 1834 that David Wilkie executed his own watercolour drawing after this painting. I'm showing Wilkie's watercolour here on the left, which is today in the British Museum collection. Oops. Next slide. Wilkie was very much part of a wider push in Britain through which to make Spanish painting and reproduction of Spanish works more popular and available, importantly, to students. And I think he really felt a certain responsibility, we'll go back to Wilkie, in this regard, having been, and I'm quoting, the only member of our academy who has seen Spain, end quote. For example, as Hilary McCartney has highlighted in her 2010 essay on the reproduction of Spanish art in Britain, while in Spain between 1827 and 1828, Wilkie wrote to Thomas Lawrence, the president of the Academy, to recommend the acquisition to the Academy's library of a new corpus of prints then being made in Madrid after works in the Royal Museum, and this remains in the Royal Academy's library today. At this time, copying was really seen as an instructive way of learning from the old masters. And beyond London's Royal Academy, copies were being commissioned and sought out by academies, art schools, teaching institutions, precisely for this purpose. And the Scottish Royal Academy in Edinburgh purchased a set of 63 copies in watercolour of historic paintings by the artist John Frederick Lewis, which were exhibited at the Academy's Life School rooms in 1853 in Edinburgh, with an accompanying catalogue as well. Nearly half of the copies by Lewis were of Spanish paintings, derived from his travels to Madrid and Seville. And as part of this set, Lewis also made 3 small watercolour copies of works from the Dulwich Picture Gallery collection. So Murillo's Game of Argolla here, The Flower Girl, and our portrait of Philip IV of Spain, then thought to be by Velázquez. And I couldn't help but also include Lewis's watercolour of Prince Baltasar Carlos, a familiar face, after the original Prado version, really a further testimony to the impact that this painting had made on 19th century artists. So in short, the Spanish paintings from the Dulwich Picture Gallery collection didn't just make it to the London Royal Academy, but also to its counterpart in Edinburgh as well. By 1851, Dulwich Picture Gallery's paintings were so well copied that it's perhaps not surprising that they were reproduced as part of so-called pictorial wall hangings, aka wallpaper, during the 1840s by the firm Jeffrey, Allen and Co. And I'm showing a portion of the wallpaper here on the left, which is today in the Victoria and Albert Museum collection. A now rather amusing advert for the wall hangings appeared in one British newspaper in 1849, which could describe them as, and I'm quoting, cheap and elegant substitutes for oil paintings, end quote. Through this wallpaper, Murillo's invitation to a game of Argolla was co-opted into a new industrial age in Britain, both in terms of the new technology used to produce the wallpaper, but also in the type of rising middle-class buyer who this type of reproduction was being made to target. The Murillo wallpaper was later exhibited by the firm Jeffrey, Allen and Co. at the Great Exhibition of 1851. And it's interesting, I think, to note that the invitation to a game of Argolla was then lent the following year, in 1852, to the Royal Academy schools to be copied and studied by the students. Interestingly, this wasn't the first time that Murillo's masterpiece had been turned into a domestic furnishing. In fact, a Flemish tapestry made around 1700, which reproduced the invitation to a game of Argolla almost exactly, was recently discovered in a private collection in Madrid. So the presence of this tapestry from 1700 right through to the wallpaper from the middle of the 19th century evidence the enduring popularity of Murillo's images from Murillo's own lifetime through to this industrial age and beyond. So by way of conclusion, the reproduction of Spanish paintings in the Dulwich Picture Gallery collection had really grown exponentially by the mid-19th century, as the final and very brief example of the wallpaper has shown. But I hope in this lecture to have demonstrated a little more specifically how, through the formal loan system to the Royal Academy schools, Dulwich's Spanish paintings were co-opted into a formalised culture of reproduction in the first half of the 19th century. The loan system to the Academy schools was inaugurated and enabled by Dulwich Picture Gallery's first keepers, Ralph Coburn and Stephen Points-Denning, who themselves made copies from the most popular Spanish paintings, as we've seen. The range of loans was then mediated by the tastes of the Royal Academicians requesting the works, a group which could include advocates of Spanish painting, such as David Wilkie. Through taking the relationship between Dulwich Picture Gallery and the Royal Academy as a case study, I hope that this lecture has shed some light on the importance of Spanish painting for British artists, part of a growing generation of Hispanophiles. Above all, though, I hope that I've highlighted the importance of lending and borrowing objects like our little portrait of Prince Baltasar Carlos to the Spanish Gallery, and how we must keep sharing art and placing fresh eyes on historic paintings. Thank you very much for listening.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much, Lucy. I will open the floor to questions if anybody would like to kickstart us. And I'll come over with the microphone. Or I'll repeat it back to you, Lindsay, if you're at the back. That's okay.
It's not a question,
yep.
But first of all, thank you very much for your lecture. It's just a tiny footnote to remind us all that Rubens was himself a Spanish subject and very proud of that fact. So in fact, we've got masses of Spanish works at Dulwich.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. And of course, Rubens' works were so important, being in the Madrid Royal Collections, for not only artists, Spanish artists working in more or less his lifetime or just after, but also artists visiting Spain in the 19th century. His works were there and so important for these artists to see. So absolutely, although he's not technically sort of presented as a Spanish artist in the...
Spanish, he happened to be a subject for the Spanish crown.
Exactly. So all of these wonderful interconnections. Thank you for highlighting that. That's a really important point.
Any other questions? I can come over with my or else I will repeat it. Oh, Jane, thank you.
Just a very quick one. How long were they on? How long were they on loan to the Royal Academy for?
So usually for around.
Sorry.
Usually, the paintings were on loan to the Royal Academy for around a year. So it would be a group of around between 5 and 7, 5, 6, 7 paintings on loan for the duration of around a year.
I was actually just going to follow up. I suppose, so you mentioned how many instances, I suppose, on the Spanish paintings were lent, proportionally in comparison to the breadth of the collection. Is that, I suppose, is that weighting, is it more Spanish paintings or is it fewer in comparison to Italian, Flemish, or the rest of the world?
That's a very good question. So I would say in terms of, so when the collection was bequeathed to Dulwich Picture Gallery, there were around 400 paintings in the collection. Today we have just over 650 paintings. But really, the Spanish paintings were a fairly, they were an important but fairly small part of the collection. So as I mentioned, around 19 works were bequeathed by the founders, which were Spanish, to the collection. So actually, when you look at the proportion of Flemish and Italian and British works in the Dulwich collection, the number of Spanish paintings that are requested by the Royal Academy Painting School is actually quite large. So most years you get 1, perhaps 2 Spanish paintings which are requested by them. So I would say for the number of Spanish paintings in the collection, they are requested a lot. And certainly if you flip the flip the narrative and look at the number of artists who were coming to Dulwich Picture Gallery to copy from the paintings in situ, the number of Spanish paintings that are being copied is incredible, actually. And Ruskin's comment about there always being at least 3 people copying in front of the Murillos is really quite representative. So when artists came to copy at Dulwich Picture Gallery, they had to fill in a special form to agree to the terms of the gallery and say what they were copying. So we have really wonderful records that we're able to track of the numbers of paintings that were being copied, and certainly in those, the number of Spanish paintings is colossal.
Any further questions? Yeah, I'll come to this gentleman first.
Was the gallery open to what we might call the general public? Was there a charge, and what was the clientele?
Really
Sorry,
wait for the microphone. Thank you. Really, really good question. So the chronology, the foundation stone is laid in 1811. John Soane comes up with his designs. Officially, the gallery is open from 1817, although artists were invited from the Royal Academy. Artists were invited to come and copy from the collection. Then 2 years later, the gallery opens officially. Now, it was open to the public. However, there was a kind of convoluted system at first to actually gain access to the collection. So you had to go and buy your ticket for Dulwich Picture Gallery in central London from places like print shops, dealers' shops. You would buy your ticket, a shilling would get you a catalogue, and then you would hop on the, well, not right at the beginning. From the 1850s, you would hop on the train and come down to Dulwich. But at the beginning of the century, you'd get in your horse and cart and come down to South London. So it was quite a mission to get down there before the railway was established in the 1850s. So in answer to your question, the gallery was open to the public, but it was quite difficult to obtain a ticket in some senses, which then, reflects in who was coming.
Why did they make it that difficult?
I think it was the practicalities. So when you read through the archives of the gallery, there are lots of rules and regulations that gallery staff aren't allowed to handle money. So the fact, that fact meant that it was actually easier from an admin point of view, quite a boring admin point of view, for shops in the centre of London, where most people would be coming from, would do that process for them, give them the catalogue, and then they would come down and enjoy their day at Dulwich Picture Gallery.
Thank you.
Not at all. Great question.
Sorry, everyone. That's right.
Hi, thanks very much. You did touch on this a little bit, but I just wondered if you could expand. Do you think more generally that the style of these kind of, especially the Murillo, with the kind of the sweetness of the expression, and did that have a wider influence on Victorian painting? And I guess I'm thinking slightly of that lovely picture of young Victoria that you've got in the Dulwich Picture Gallery. She's got such a round face and these big eyes. And I just wonder whether you see a link between the Spanish style and then the kind of Victorian fondness for children and sweetness and all of that.
Thank you. Thanks, Alison. That's such a good question. Yes, I think definitely. So as you said, there's that wonderful quote from David Wilkie about the sweetness and kind of femininity of Murillo's style, which he found very appealing, but I think which weaves through other commentaries by 19th century artists and writers on Spanish painting. Yes, I think it did definitely that style did, I think, infuse painting in the late 18th century and the 19th century. As you mentioned, we have a lovely little painting of Queen Victoria by Stephen Poyntz Denning, our second keeper of Dulwich Picture Gallery, which is a little 4-year-old Queen Victoria in the middle of this landscape, which I think is that there's a sentimentality in that painting, but also sort of detectable more generally in Victorian painting, which I think could be credited in some way with the influence of Spanish painting, and certainly with Gainsborough, those fancy pictures in inverted commas where you get these pastoral figures in these imaginary, quite romantic landscapes, I think definitely are infused with the spirit of Murillo. Yeah, great question.
Hi. I'm just wondering if the practice of students copying in person from the loaned pictures, does that still continue? And is Murillo still favoured 3 people in front and nobody else?
Great, thank you. That's another great question. So the loans to the Royal Academy no longer continue in the way that they did. However, we have other ways at Dulwich Picture Gallery now that artists form connections with the collection, and actually that sort of connection back to our 19th century history with artists is a really important kind of inspiration for that programme. So we currently have a programme of activity at Dulwich Picture Gallery called Unlocking Paintings, which is all about placing fresh eyes on historic art, and one of the strands that we work on is displays made by contemporary artists. So we've had Samaya Critchlow, who I showed in the presentation, other artists like Anthony Daly, Sarah Shammer, we've got Rachel Jones in the summer. All of these artists spend an extended time with the collection over the period of a year and make work which is inspired by the collection. And actually Samaya Critchlow's show, which we have on at the moment, contains some of her drawings and copies of paintings in the collection. And actually she was fascinated in this relationship that artists had in the 19th century with our collection. So yes and no in answer to your question. We no longer have this kind of official loan system that ended just before the Second World War to the Royal Academy. But we try and foster that kind of culture of spending close time with the collection still through programmes like Unlocking Paintings. And of course, loaning in general is something that's really important for us at Dulwich. So we're always very keen to send our paintings out on adventures to find new contexts.
any further questions? I think that's it. So in which case, it just leaves me to say thank you, Lucy, for your time and generosity this evening. And we look forward to seeing everybody again at our next events. So please do visit our website to see what the programme ahead for the summer is. So thank you, Lucy.